The colossal alien Vulcan warships in high orbit blasted massive tungsten railgun rounds down upon the human cities, raining destruction and death as the battered hulk of Earth's ancient supertank Prometheus rumbled to life deep underground. Ex-Marine Jason Williams gripped the worn leather of the commander's seat, his knuckles pale as he flipped switches and brought the secret weapon's powerful reactor up to combat readiness, knowing that only this reverse-engineered machine and his hard-earned skills could save humanity from annihilation at the claws of the vicious extraterrestrial invaders. Jason's heart slammed against his ribs as his white-hot terror from the recurring nightmares of the last Vulcan war flooded back into his mind. The ruthless aliens Vulcans had returned as promised, armed with even deadlier weapons than before, and this time their armada blotted out the sun with cruel intent. Earth's panicked citizens fled as the Vulcan soldiers swarmed their cities, gunning down anyone in their path, driven by seething vengeance from their last defeat at humanity's hands. As the only living veteran of the Prometheus crew, Jason alone held the key to ending the aliens' brutal conquest once and for all. If he could force his battered body and mind back into the titanium coffin that the supertank had almost become so many years ago. He slid his hands over the controls, ghosts of past triumphs and horrors swirling through his brain, and prayed that this time would be humanity's salvation instead of its epitaph. There were no second chances left. The massive blast doors shuddered open as Jason entered the secret underground bunker that housed the Prometheus. He slid his ID card through the lock and typed in his passcode, his fingers moving on instinct alone. The heavy doors hissed apart, revealing the ancient supertank in all its armored glory. As he walked across the dusty concrete floor towards the hulking metal beast, Jason's mind was assaulted by painful memories of the last war. He saw flashes of searing laser blasts piercing the night, smelled the acrid tang of melted steel and charred flesh. The screams of the dying echoed in his ears, human and Vulcan voices blending into a hellish chorus, nearly drowned out by the earth-shaking booms of the Prometheus's experimental dark energy cannon as it unleashed its wrath upon the alien hordes. Jason shook himself back to the present. He had a job to do. Humanity was counting on him. He couldn't afford to let the ghosts of his past failures haunt him now. Steeling his nerves, Jason clambered up the side of the Prometheus, his boots clanging against the rusted rungs of the access ladder. With a heave, he twisted the handles of the entry hatch, the shriek of unoiled hinges piercing the air as the armored door swung open reluctantly. The familiar stench of oxidized metal filled his nostrils as he lowered himself into the commander's chair, the seat conforming to his body as if he had never left. His fingers slid into the grooves they had worn into the control yoke during countless desperate hours at the helm, engaged in a deadly duel with the merciless Vulcan forces. Jason's hands moved on autopilot, flipping switches and pressing buttons in a sequence burned into his muscle memory by the fires of war. A deep, sickening vibration shook the hull as the eldritch reactor at the heart of the machine sputtered to life, ancient capacitors and relays sparking as unholy energies coursed through them once more. The overhead lamps flickered and dimmed as the Prometheus's power core greedily siphoned energy from the base's grid, fueling its ravenous appetite. As the indicators on the status panel winked green one by one, a sense of cold dread settled in the pit of Jason's stomach, sending a shiver up his spine. The Prometheus was undoubtedly powerful, but at what cost? The technologies used in its construction were beyond human understanding, reverse-engineered from the twisted creations of the Vulcans. Could this alien horror truly be controlled, or was he merely the jailer of an unfathomable evil, imprisoned for a time, but never truly tamed? His dark musings were suddenly interrupted by a burst of panicked chatter over the radio. The Vulcan vanguard had landed near Phoenix, their troops already rampaging through the outskirts as they cut a bloody swath towards the heart of the city. The EDF defenders were on the back foot, pleading for reinforcements before the aliens reached the capital. They needed the Prometheus, and they needed it now. Jason throttled the engine, the mighty fusion turbine roaring like a hungry beast as it propelled the massive treads into motion. The Prometheus lurched forward, smashing through the wall of the bunker and into the harsh light of day. With a growl of straining metal, the supertank rolled out of its tomb and onto the barren landscape. Dirt and debris fountained into the air as the monstrous machine carved its path towards the distant sounds of battle, ready to meet the Vulcan invaders head-on. Onward to Phoenix it rolled, to glory or oblivion. The Prometheus was on the prowl once more, and may the gods help whoever stood in its way. As the Prometheus rolled across the barren wasteland towards the embattled city of Phoenix, a frantic voice crackled over the radio, yanking Jason's attention away from his dark thoughts. "Commander Williams, this is Colonel Henderson of the 117th Recon Battalion. We've discovered a previously unknown Vulcan installation dangerously close to your current vector. There's some kind of pulsing organic structure at the center that's defying our scans. We can't make heads or tails of it, but it's got the brass spooked something fierce. They want you to divert and take it out before you link up with the main force." Jason swore under his breath, slamming a fist against the armrest. Of course the damn aliens couldn't make this simple. "Acknowledged, Colonel. Send me the coordinates and I'll deal with it." "Coordinates transmitted. Give 'em hell, Commander. Henderson out." Plotting the new course with a few quick keystrokes, Jason wrenched the control yokes to the side, sending the Prometheus veering off towards the new threat. As he approached the location, the tank's systems started going berserk. Displays flickered and glitched, the targeting reticle twitching spasmodically across the screen. Even the control surfaces jerked beneath his hands, as if the machine itself was gripped by some primal terror. Frowning, Jason glanced at the readouts, trying to make sense of the cascading faults and errors. What the hell was going on? The Prometheus had always run smooth as silk before, the Eldritch reactor providing an unshakable baseline of power. For it to be spasming like this. His train of thought was promptly derailed as the Prometheus crested the lip of a crater, finally bringing the Vulcan construct into view. Jason's eyes widened in a mixture of disbelief and raw, mind-numbing horror. A pulsating mass of chitin and metal rose from the crater's heart like a grotesque boil. Sickly green flesh undulated beneath a lattice of purple, vein-like tendrils, the entire abomination throbbing in a nauseating mockery of breath. Jason gagged, bile rising in his throat as he tried to process the sheer wrongness of what he was seeing. It was an affront to the laws of nature, a twisted perversion of all things right and proper. His sanity strained at its tethers as his mind struggled to accept the loathsome reality before him. Tearing his eyes away from the mind-bending abomination, Jason focused on the shimmering dome of energy that surrounded it. A Vulcan force field, no doubt, protecting this insult to creation from humanity's righteous fury. But even as he watched, a flickering hole irised open in the field, disgorging a horde of skittering nightmares, easily the size of main battle tanks. These horrors were a blasphemous fusion of crustacean and insect, all writhing mandibles and twitching segmented limbs. Their compound eyes swiveled independently, focusing on the Prometheus with a glint of soulless hunger. The monstrous creatures surged forward, their chitinous legs propelling them towards Jason's tank with terrifying speed. Mandibles clacked and dripping proboscises unfurled, ready to tear and rend metal and flesh alike. The nightmarish creature slammed into the Prometheus with bone-jarring force, its scythe-like claws raking across the armored hull with a screech of tortured metal. Jason swore, his hands flying across the controls as he tried to bring the tank's formidable weapons to bear. The Prometheus' automated defense systems opened up, spitting a hail of depleted uranium slugs at the monstrosity, but they simply ricocheted off its nigh impenetrable exoskeleton with a series of harmless pings. Snarling in frustration, Jason wrestled with the aiming joystick, trying to line up a clear shot with the main cannon. But the writhing horror's flailing appendages blocked his line of fire, the abomination seeming to anticipate his every move. In a final, desperate gambit, Jason stabbed his finger down on the incendiary rocket launch button. A salvo of thermobaric warheads streaked from the launcher, slamming into the creature in a series of concussive detonations that sent gouts of searing flame washing over its carapace. The monster reeled back, momentarily stunned by the heat and force of the blasts. But Jason had no time to celebrate his minor victory. The rest of the horrific brood was already swarming around the Prometheus, their compound eyes glittering with malevolent hunger as they sought out any chink in the tank's armor. Ramming the throttle into reverse, Jason sent the Prometheus barreling backwards, its massive treads pulping one of the creatures into a splatter of ichor and shattered chitin. He swung the cannon around and fired point-blank into another horror, the hypervelocity shell reducing it to a fine mist of shredded flesh. But the monsters kept coming, undeterred by the destruction of their brethren. They attacked from all sides, forcing Jason to constantly shift his focus, never allowing him a clear shot. The beasts were learning, adapting to his tactics with chilling speed. A shrill alarm pierced the air as warning lights flashed across the control panel. One of the creatures had managed to pierce a fuel line, spilling precious hydrogen across the hull. Another had severed a bundle of hydraulic cables, reducing the main cannon's traverse speed to a crawl. Acrid smoke began to fill the cabin as ominous arcs of electricity danced across the instrument panels. In that moment of chaos, a grim clarity descended over Jason. There was only one way this could end. Slamming the throttle to the floor, he sent the Prometheus hurtling towards the towering, pulsating abomination at the heart of the crater. The tank plowed through the swarming horde, its momentum turning the beasts into smears of crushed flesh beneath its inexorable treads. As he closed to nearly point-blank range, Jason diverted every ounce of power to the Prometheus's secret weapon, the dark energy cannon. The eldritch device hummed with an unearthly resonance, reality itself seeming to warp and twist around its focusing arrays as it glutted itself on the reactor's surging output. Agony lanced through Jason's hands as arcs of stray energy danced across the control surfaces, the smell of seared flesh filling his nostrils. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain, he kept his fingers clenched around the trigger, letting the weapon build to a crescendo of world-rending power. With a final defiant roar, Jason unleashed the cannon's pent-up fury directly at the heart of the Vulcan abomination. The pencil-thin beam of utter darkness lanced out, only to splinter into a kaleidoscope of fractured energy as it struck the shimmering barrier surrounding the structure. The otherworldly force field seemed to absorb the cannon's blast effortlessly, warping and flexing, but remaining utterly unbreached. The grotesque pulsating mass at the barrier's heart almost seemed to writhe with mocking laughter, reveling in the futility of Jason's struggle. But then, as the last urges of the cannon's power dissipated against the shield, a hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the field's iridescent surface. It was the tiniest of cracks, barely visible to the naked eye, but it was there. But just as the fracture opened, the remaining abominations went berserk. Heedless now of the searing fury of the main gun, the horde threw themselves bodily at the Prometheus, their monstrous forms slamming against the tank's hull with bone-jarring force. Chitin cracked and ichor splattered, but still they came, seeking to bury the machine under the weight of their twisted flesh. Jason fought to keep the Prometheus upright as blow after blow rocked the vehicle, his harness digging into his shoulders with bruising force. His fingers danced across the controls, diverting every spare watt of power to the structural integrity fields. The main cannon fell silent, its energy rerouted to reinforcing the buckling hull. Snarling with frustrated rage, Jason fell back on the tank's secondary armaments. The rocket pods belched gouts of fire, the chattering autocannons spat tongues of tracer rounds. Each precisely aimed burst blew ragged holes in the surging horde, sending chitin shards and gobbets of meat pinwheeling through the air. But for every beast he felled, another took its place, scrambling over the bloating corpses of their kin in single-minded frenzy. Jason cut them down, one after another, his world narrowing to the glowing targeting reticles and the thunder of guns. Yet even as he fought, his eyes flicked again and again to the pulsing abomination at the crater's heart. The crack in the shield was widening, the edges peeling back like a rotting wound. Jason's stomach knotted with dread, terrified of the eldritch nightmares that might come spilling out at any moment. Suddenly a piercing shriek knifed through the cacophony of battle, setting Jason's teeth on edge. His eyes widened as the abomination's writhing tendrils began to retract, pulling back like a blooming flower to reveal a glistening, fleshy orifice. It yawned open, a maw of pulsating meat and dripping ichor. Something stirred in those fetid depths. A palpable aura of malice rolled forth, so intense it stole the breath from Jason's lungs. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Jason's blood ran cold. It was Vulcan, but warped beyond all recognition. Towering and emaciated, its mottled flesh was riddled with pulsing, cancerous technology. Tubes and wires plunged into its parchment skin, weeping viscous fluids. But worst were its eyes, twin pits of swirling madness that seemed to drink in the light. With a flash of sickening realization, Jason knew he looked upon no common soldier, but a Sire-Father, one of the Vulcans' most twisted and feared leaders. The monster's lipless mouth split in a razor-slash-grin, a cruel mockery of mirth. It raised one long, wickedly taloned finger, pointing at the lone human tank. A gesture of challenge and of certain doom. As the towering Sire-Father strode forth from the grotesque, pulsating structure, the very fabric of reality seemed to recoil at its presence. The eldritch abomination radiated an aura of soul-rending wrongness, an affront to all natural law. The remaining insectoid horrors immediately broke off their assault, skittering back to form a chillingly deferential circle around their cybernetic master. Jason found himself alone, caught between a wall of chitin and the approaching avatar of doom. The Vulcan moved with a fluid, predatory grace that belied its malformed frame, each step precisely calculated. Tubes pulsed and wires twitched beneath its mottled skin as it closed the distance, unholy energies crackling around its talons. Jason's mouth went dry, his heart hammering a staccato beat against his ribs. He knew in his bones that he was outmatched, that this twisted fusion of flesh and machine was far beyond the Prometheus' power to destroy. But he was a Marine, a warrior sworn to defend Earth to his last breath. He would not cower, not while strength remained in his body. Sending a quick, desperate prayer to whatever gods might still listen, Jason pushed the throttle to the floor, the treads throwing up a spray of gravel as the tank surged forward. The main cannon swiveled to track the approaching horror, Jason's targeting reticle centering squarely on the Sire-Father's gaunt chest. His finger tightened on the trigger, the dark energy capacitors whining as they prepared to unleash annihilation. The cannon roared, the pencil-thin beam of utter darkness lancing out to impale the Vulcan dead center and passing clean through, leaving the creature utterly unscathed. A jagged, discordant laugh echoed through Jason's mind, a telepathic intrusion that felt like razors dragged across his sanity. The pain brought tears to his eyes, his teeth clenching until he tasted blood. "Foolish ape," the voice sneered, each word dripping with venomous contempt. "Your primitive weapons are less than useless before the might of the Ascended. I have transcended the limitations of mere flesh and steel. I am the glorious future, the inevitable triumph of the Vulcan race. And you are nothing more than a relic of a species on the brink of extinction, a footnote in the majestic chronicles of our conquest." As if to punctuate its boast, the Sire-Father made a dismissive gesture, a casual flick of its emaciated wrist. An invisible wave of force slammed into the Prometheus like the fist of an angry god, tearing the 60-ton war machine clean off its treads with contemptuous ease. The tank cartwheeled through the air, its structure groaning in protest as it tumbled end over end. Jason was flung violently against his restraints, his bones creaking under the strain. Control panels sparked and ruptured, the acrid stench of scorched insulation filling the cabin. Warning klaxons blared as the Prometheus's systems flickered and died, the eldritch reactor guttering like a candle in a hurricane. Through a red haze of pain, Jason dimly registered the coppery taste of blood on his tongue, the warm wetness soaking his uniform, telling him that his ribs weren't the only things that had broken. But even as blackness encroached on his vision and agony threatened to drag him down into oblivion, a desperate spark of hope flared in Jason's chest. The wild tumble of the tank had brought its prow pointing directly at the shimmering dome of the Vulcan energy field, and the spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface like cracks in thin ice. The barrier had been weakened by the Prometheus's impact, its structural integrity compromised. It was a 1-in-a-million chance, a singular moment of vulnerability in the Vulcan's otherwise impenetrable defenses. Jason didn't hesitate. With the last of his fading strength, he wrenched the emergency override lever, bypassing the failed reactor and drawing directly from the tank's auxiliary power cells. The capacitors shrieked as they flooded with energy, red line warnings flashing across the few remaining functional displays. Diverting every erg of power he could scrape together into the main cannon and missile racks, Jason centered his targeting reticle on the widening cracks and squeezed the trigger. The weapons unleashed everything they had in a single cataclysmic fusillade of destruction. Hypervelocity shells, thermobaric rockets, and beams of weaponized darkness converged on the fractures, Jason's wordless howl of defiance lost in the roar of the barrage. The weakened barrier flared incandescent as it struggled to repel the onslaught, the cracks widening into chasms under the relentless bombardment. For a single, breathless moment, the force field held, before shattering like glass, unable to withstand the Prometheus's dying fury. Shards of exotic energy rained down as the barrier collapsed, the pent-up forces it had been restraining lashing out in a maelstrom of unbridled chaos. For a breathless moment, the world was lost in a cataclysm of shrieking energy and shattering metal. The Prometheus' dying salvo slammed into the weakened force field with the fury of the apocalypse itself. Reality fractured, the barrier folding in on itself like a house of cards before a hurricane. Through eyes blurred with blood and tears, Jason watched the hated dome collapse, the pent-up forces it had restrained, lashing out in a maelstrom of destruction. The shockwave hit like the fist of an angry god, flinging the ruined tank through the air like a child's toy. Jason's body screamed in protest as he was slammed against the restraints, bones grinding against each other with a sickening crunch. The taste of copper flooded his mouth, his vision swimming as unconsciousness threatened to drag him down into the abyss. But through the haze of agony, a flicker of triumph flared in his battered soul. The force field was down, the Vulcan abomination laid bare to the world. For a fleeting instant, Jason dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. That Earth still had a chance, however slim. The treads hit the ground with a bone-jarring crunch, the suspension shattering under the impact. Jason's head cracked against the control panel, stars exploding across his vision. Groaning, he tried to will his leaden limbs to move, to pull himself from the wreckage and face the enemy on his feet like a Marine should. But before he could so much as twitch, an unseen force seized him in its grasp, dragging him out through the shattered view screen like a rag doll. Invisible bands constricted around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs as he was hoisted into the air, suspended before the towering figure of the Sire Father, like an insect pinned to a card. The creature was unscathed, its form now limned with an aura of eye-searing wrongness. It regarded the broken human before it with a look of cruel amusement, head tilting to one side in a gesture that was hideously, unnaturally insectile. Jason snarled through blood-flecked lips, straining against the telekinetic bonds with every fiber of his being. His muscles screamed, his shattered bones grinding together, but it was useless. He was held fast, as helpless as a newborn babe, before the titanic power of the Vulcan monstrosity. The Sire Father drifted closer, the stench of decay and sour metal washing over Jason in a nauseating wave. A taloned finger reached out to brush his cheek in grotesque parody of tenderness, the touch burning like acid against his skin. "I could kill you now, human," it whispered, its voice dripping with sadistic glee. "It would be so easy, like snuffing out a candle. But no. I have a better use for you. You will serve as a testament to the folly of defiance, a living warning to all who would oppose the Vulcan Empire." Jason opened his mouth to scream defiance, to spit in the face of this nightmare given flesh, but his words turned to ashes on his tongue as the creature began to chant. The syllables were harsh and guttural, tearing at the air like rusty hooks. They wormed their way into Jason's ears, burrowing into his brain like a swarm of hungry maggots. He convulsed, his body spasming uncontrollably as he felt an alien presence force its way into his mind. It ripped through his memories like a hurricane, shredding his very identity with callous disregard. Jason could feel himself being hollowed out, his essence scooped away piece by piece to make room for something cold and utterly inhuman. He screamed then, a wordless howl of pure animal agony as he felt himself being unmade. His vision began to darken at the edges, the void rising up to claim him. Desperately he clung to one last thought, a single word that had always been his anchor, his guiding star through all the horrors of war. But it slipped away like sand through his fingers, and he fell into the abyss, a final despairing question, echoing through the silence. Why? Agony, white-hot and all-consuming, was the first thing that greeted Jason as he swam up from the depths of oblivion. Every nerve ending screamed, every bone felt shattered, every muscle torn and bruised. But even as his battered body wept, his mind recoiled in ultimate horror. There was something in his head, a presence, cold and alien and utterly terribly wrong. He could feel it moving behind his eyes, slithering through his thoughts like a vile serpent. With a surge of terrified revulsion, Jason realized the awful truth. The Sire-Father, that nightmare-given flesh, had poured itself into his skull, hollowing him out to puppeteer his ruined shell. Panic surged through him, a desperate need to flee, to fight, to claw this monstrosity out of his brain. But his body would not obey. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, a mute and helpless witness as the Vulcan raised his broken form like a marionette. His body shambled to its feet, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait that sent fresh waves of agony through his abused nerves. The Sire-Father turned his head, surveying the blasted landscape through eyes that had once been Jason's alone. His gaze fell upon the twisted wreckage of his tank and the exposed abomination it had died to unveil. The Vulcan raised his hand, Jason's hand, and began to chant once more. The words were jagged hooks in Jason's mind, tearing at the tattered edges of his sanity. And to his horror, he felt something answer. From the crumpled ruin of the Prometheus, a sickly light began to pulse. The Eldritch reactor, that obscene heart of dark energy, was waking once more, called to unholy life by the Sire-Father's vile magic. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, pieces of the dead machine began to peel away. Armor plates, bits of tread, fragments of the mighty cannon. They wrenched free and rose into the air, orbiting the glowing reactor in a macabre dance. Shards of shattered chitin and gobbets of ichor soon joined the grisly ballet, the remnants of Jason's vanquished foes eager to partake in this final blasphemy. Faster and faster the maelstrom spun, the reactor pulsing at its heart like a fiendish star. The Sire-Father's chant built to a crescendo, an exultant ode to an evil beyond imagining. With a final triumphant shout, the Vulcan thrust Jason's hand towards the alien structure. The swirling debris, an obscene fusion of metal and mutated flesh, slammed into the waiting receptacle. It sank into the pulsating mass like bullets into rotten meat, each impact accompanied by a burst of sickly radiance. Before Jason's helpless gaze, the structure began to change. It writhed and bulged, putrid flesh flowing like wax to sheathe the embedded machinery. Vestigial limbs burst forth only to fuse together into lashing tentacles, grasping claws, whipping tails studded with bony scythe blades. The thing rose and rose, towering into the poisoned sky, a blasphemous titan of twisted metal and cancerous meat. And there, at its center, a seam split wide, peeling back like a festering wound to reveal a deeper darkness. A hole in the world, a gaping maw hungry to consume everything, to make a mockery of natural law. The Sire-Father raised Jason's head, and he was forced to stare into that lightless abyss. In its depths he saw a terrible promise, a future in which life and sanity were less than a memory, a future where the Vulcan ruled supreme. "Behold," his own voice hissed, no longer under his control. The words tasted like bile on his tongue. "The instrument of your species' extinction, and the key to the Vulcan's ultimate triumph. The titanic abomination began to move, its thunderous tread shaking the earth. With each awful step, the rift at its core pulsed wider, an obscene heartbeat heralding the end of all things. Its path would take it straight to the distant city, the last bastion of humanity. And Jason could do nothing but watch, a helpless passenger in his own body, as the Sire Father's laughter echoed in the vaults of his mind. Trapped within the prison of his own mind, Jason could only watch in mute horror as the Sire Father turned his body towards the towering abomination, a cruel smile twisting his lips. The Vulcan puppet master's exultant laughter echoed through his skull as it prepared to unleash the monstrosity's world-ending power upon the unsuspecting city. But as Jason's gaze fell upon the swirling vortex at the heart of the structure, something shifted deep within his consciousness. A flicker of memory, faint as a guttering candle, danced at the edges of his thoughts. He latched onto it with the desperation of a drowning man, pouring every ounce of his will into fanning that ember into a blaze. Images flashed through his mind's eye, disjointed at first, then coalescing into a vision of breathtaking clarity. He saw the Prometheus, not as the ruined hulk it now was, but transformed, a gleaming avatar of hope and protection, a bulwark against the darkness that threatened to engulf the world. At the machine's core, the dark energy reactor pulsed not with eldritch menace, but with a pure incandescent radiance that banished all shadows. It was a light to guide the way, to illuminate the path to victory against the Vulcan scourge. As the vision crystallized in Jason's mind, he felt a subtle shift in the invader's presence. The Sire Father's triumphant crowing faltered, replaced by a rising note of disbelief and fear as it sensed the balance of power tipping away from its grasp. Jason's body spasmed, caught in the crossfire of the mental struggle. The Sire Father redoubled its efforts, seeking to crush this unexpected rebellion, but Jason's will was a fortress, unyielding and indomitable. He clung to the image of the reborn Prometheus, pouring every fiber of his being into the construct. Inch by agonizing inch, he wrested control of his limbs from the Vulcan's clutches. His body lurched into motion, not towards the waiting portal and the city beyond, but back to the wreckage of his fallen steed. The Sire Father raged within his mind, hurling psychic barbs of purest agony, but Jason pressed on, undeterred. His hand closed around the reactor housing, his skin blistering from the heat pouring off the damaged core. In that moment, a surge of power, unlike anything he had ever known, flooded through his veins. It was a cleansing fire, scouring away the taint of the Vulcan's presence, purifying mind and soul alike. The Sire Father's final, despairing wail faded to nothingness as the alien essence was expelled from Jason's body in a burst of searing, white-hot radiance. He stood alone in his own flesh once more, the master of his destiny. But there was no time to revel in his freedom. The abomination stirred behind him, the energies building within its core reaching a fever pitch. Jason knew that he had only moments to act before it unleashed its devastating power. Closing his eyes, he reached out with his thoughts, calling to the scattered remnants of the Prometheus. Like iron filings drawn to a magnet, the shattered pieces of armor and machinery lifted into the air, swirling around him in a glittering vortex of metal. But instead of reforming into the familiar shape of the tank, the components flowed like quicksilver, merging and reshaping themselves according to Jason's will. They encased his body in a shell of gleaming steel, a perfect fusion of man and machine. At the heart of this new form, Jason cradled the reactor, its light now a steady, unwavering beacon against the encroaching darkness. He had become something more than human, more than a mere vehicle of war. He was a guardian, a champion of life and hope, ready to stand against the tide of extinction. The air crackled with energy as Jason turned to face the looming abomination, the reactor's glow intensifying to a blinding crescendo. The machine intelligence that had once guided the Prometheus now whispered in his mind, flooding his consciousness with tactical data and system readouts. He felt the hum of power coursing through his new body, the fusion of flesh and steel, granting him strength and speed beyond anything he had ever dreamed. Every movement was imbued with purpose, every thought crystal clear and razor sharp. Jason raised his hand, the armored digits flexing in anticipation. The abomination loomed before him, a twisted mockery of life, pulsing with a hunger to unmake all of creation. He knew that this would be the fight of his life, a battle not just for his own survival, but for the fate of his entire species. But as he stared into the heart of the darkness, Jason felt no fear, only a grim determination. He had been forged in the crucible of war, tempered by loss and sacrifice. He was ready for this moment, ready to give everything to defend his world. The reactor flared brighter still, bathing the battlefield in its radiance. Jason felt its power surging through every fiber of his being, a raging torrent waiting to be unleashed. He took a step forward, his armored boots sinking into the scorched earth, leaving molten footprints in his wake. Jason stared down the titanic abomination, the dark energy reactor thrumming with power in his hands. The monstrosity's tentacles lashed the air, seeking to rend him limb from limb, but Jason was faster. His new mechanical body, an extension of his own will, dodged and wove through the forest of grasping appendages with preternatural grace. The reactor's light pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a piercing beacon in the darkness. Jason could feel the machine's raw hunger, its primal urge to consume and annihilate, but he tempered that destructive impulse with his own indomitable will, focusing the reactor's might into a single searing beam of pure energy. He thrust the crackling beam at the abomination's core, aiming for the swirling vortex of madness at its heart. The livid light speared into the maelstrom, warring against the unnatural forces that bound the monstrosity together. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, with an earth-shattering roar, the abomination began to come apart at the seams. Its writhing form unraveled like a cancerous tapestry, diseased flesh and twisted metal sloughing away into the hungry light. Jason pushed forward, pouring more and more of the reactor's power into the beam. He could feel his own strength ebbing, the machine's endless appetite siphoning his life force, but he couldn't relent. Not now, not when victory was so close. The abomination thrashed in its death throes, a flailing tentacle catching Jason across the chest with the force of a runaway train. He flew backwards, the reactor tumbling from his grasp as he hit the unyielding ground with a bone-jarring crunch. Agony lanced through his body, his vision flickering at the edges. Through the haze of pain he saw the vortex at the abomination's heart, still churning, still growing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. If he didn't act now, that insatiable hunger would consume everything, tear the very fabric of reality asunder. Gritting his teeth, Jason dragged himself towards the fallen reactor, every inch an eternity of suffering. His fingers closed around its housing just as the vortex's pull became inescapable, dragging him inexorably towards oblivion. With a final defiant roar, Jason plunged into the heart of the maelstrom, the reactor held before him like a talisman against the dark. Blinding light engulfed him, searing away thought, memory, self. And then, silence. An eerie, unnatural quiet settled over the battlefield as the abomination finally disintegrated into nothingness. The scattered survivors emerged from hiding to stare in mute disbelief at the scorched crater where the abomination had stood only moments before. But of Jason and his miraculous machine they found no sign. Some whispered that he had been consumed by the vortex, sacrificing himself so that others might live. Others claimed that he had transcended mortal form, his final act of bravery granting him a glimpse of the divine. But one truth was undeniable. Through Jason's courage and sacrifice, the Vulcan threat was ended forever. Their dreams of conquest lay shattered in the dust. Earth was safe, but the price had been steep. As the smoke of battle cleared, the true cost began to sink in. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.